Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos en este acto. Es un placer ver el Ramón y Cajal, este anfiteatro que lleva el nombre de nuestro científico más ilustre, abarrotado y además lleno de gente joven y de estudiantes. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Queridos rectores también de las universidades públicas de Madrid que nos acompañáis, algunos sentados ahí abajo, en otros como el rector de la Politécnica, el profesor Guillermo Cisneros, acompañándonos aquí en la mesa. Gracias por estar aquí también. Querido Miguel Ángel Moratinos, presidente de REDS, la Red Española para el Desarrollo Sostenible. Querido dear Professor Sachs, thanks for being here. Como decía antes, venimos aquí a escuchar al profesor Sachs, así que lo único que quiero es agradecer y dar la bienvenida al profesor Sachs y agradecerle que haya hecho hueco en estas 24 horas, únicas 24 horas que va a pasar en España, en Madrid en concreto, para ilustrarnos, para enseñarnos dentro de las actividades del máster conjunto entre la Universidad Complutense de Madrid y la Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, el máster de Estrategias y Tecnologías para el Desarrollo que hacemos conjuntamente dentro de lo que es el campus de excelencia de Moncloa entre ambas universidades. Como queremos tener tiempo para que luego haya pues, un pequeño turno de preguntas, aunque solamente sea media docena, entonces yo simplemente termino aquí dándoos de nuevo la bienvenida y cedo la palabra a Guillermo Cisneros, rector de la Universidad Politécnica de Madrid.
Muchas gracias, rector. Querido rector de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid, querido profesor Sachs, querido presidente de la Red Española de Desarrollo Sostenible, rectores de otras universidades públicas de la Comunidad de Madrid, profesores, personal de Administración y Servicios, estudiantes, queridos amigos todos que nos acompañan hoy en este salón. Salón Ramón y Cajal, como bien ha dicho el rector de la Universidad Complutense. Desde que en septiembre del año 2015 Naciones Unidas aprobó la Agenda 2030 sintetizada en los 17 Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, se ha abierto una gran oportunidad para desarrollar una nueva economía mundial que afronte con éxito los dos grandes problemas de nuestra actual civilización: la desigualdad social creciente y el desarrollo medioambiental. El profesor Sachs ha tenido un papel destacado en el impulso de esta importante agenda. Es una agenda que representa lo mejor de la comunidad internacional que, pese a sus muchas deficiencias, ha demostrado que es capaz de ponerse metas comunes, ambiciosas, medibles y concretas, y trabajar conjuntamente en su logro. Los 17 Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible abarcan multitud de desafíos en los que nuestras universidades, y especialmente una universidad tecnológica como es la Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, pueden aportar conocimiento, ingenio y ganas de trabajar por su consecución. Por ejemplo, hablamos de energía y de su generación, de transporte y uso responsable. Hablamos de agua y las infraestructuras necesarias para su almacenamiento, transporte y gestión. Hablamos de la extracción, producción y transformación de materias primas en condiciones más responsables y sostenibles. Hablamos de acceso a la información y a la educación, y quizás sea este, el acceso a la educación de calidad, el elemento más relevante para poder cambiar una sociedad. Nosotros, como universidad pública, somos muy conscientes de ello. Pobreza, hambre, salud, educación, igualdad de género, agua, energía, economía, desigualdad, ciudades, consumo, cambio climático, diversidad, paz y justicia y el refuerzo de las alianzas necesarias para conseguir todo esto son en resumen, esos 17 objetivos marcados para 2030. Podemos crear, y lo estamos haciendo ya, como es el ejemplo de este campus de excelencia internacional de Moncloa, del que este año se cumplen sus primeros 90 años de existencia, verdaderos laboratorios de ideas y de prácticas que aceleren la transformación que esta agenda representa. Es una transformación crucial para el futuro de todos, para la cual es vital involucrar y trabajar con nuestros estudiantes. En este nuevo marco debemos formar, como estamos haciendo ya en nuestras titulaciones, a los profesionales preparados para liderar esta transición hacia un mundo más sostenible, y debemos fomentar actividades que muestren a nuestros estudiantes esta realidad que van a tener que potenciar en su desarrollo profesional. Quisiera destacar en este punto el máster en Estrategias y Tecnologías para el Desarrollo Humano, que impartimos conjuntamente la Universidad Politécnica y la Universidad Complutense de Madrid en nuestra Escuela Internacional de Posgrado, como un ejemplo de este compromiso, y agradecer especialmente al profesor Sachs el haberse fijado en él para su participación en este acto que hoy nos reúne aquí. Hace tiempo ya que en la Universidad Politécnica de Madrid decidimos ir más allá de la retórica, demasiado frecuente cuando se habla de sostenibilidad, y pasar a la acción, poniendo en marcha iniciativas concretas que permitan que nuestros conocimientos y nuestra capacidad investigadora se orienten decididamente a la resolución de problemas de alto significado social y ambiental, como los que plantean los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible. Así, en 2013 creamos el Centro de Innovación en Tecnología para el Desarrollo Humano, conocido como ITD-UPM. Centro este que surge desde la iniciativa de los propios profesores e investigadores, convencidos de la necesidad de crear nuevos espacios para el trabajo colaborativo e interdisciplinar, para abordar problemas complejos y de la ventaja que supone afrontar desde un punto de vista multidisciplinar este tipo de desafíos. El Centro de Innovación en Tecnología para el Desarrollo Humano ha sido diseñado para alinear nuestras iniciativas en este ámbito y para promover alianzas con administraciones, entidades públicas y privadas y representantes del tercer sector en pos de utilizar nuestras capacidades tecnológicas para la resolución de actuaciones concretas en cooperación para el desarrollo. Algunos de sus representantes se encuentran hoy aquí, en este acto, y quiero agradecerles su presencia. En la Universidad Politécnica de Madrid y en el conjunto de universidades públicas españolas estamos convencidos de que se abre un tiempo para la colaboración, para sumar y multiplicar nuestros esfuerzos, que tenemos que asumir una gestión más sostenible y responsable de nuestros recursos, como ejemplo para la ciudadanía, si queremos hacer posible un escenario de vida mejor para todos, en el que se haga realidad la Agenda 2030. Por eso quiero terminar refiriéndome a la labor que ya hemos emprendido entre las universidades españolas, en el marco de la Conferencia de Rectores de las Universidades Españolas, CRUE, para impulsar juntos estrategias y planes de sostenibilidad en todas nuestras universidades. Querido Carlos, querido profesor Sachs, querido Miguel Ángel, lamentablemente un compromiso ineludible previo a la convocatoria de esta cita me impide quedarme a la conferencia, pero no quería dejar pasar la oportunidad de agradecer al profesor Sachs y a su equipo el haber elegido este marco para hacer la presentación en Madrid. Agradecer a todos, profesores, estudiantes y personal que siempre está detrás de los focos, pero que sin ellos nunca sería nada de esto posible, el haberlo organizado, así como agradecer a todos ustedes su presencia en este acto incomparable de la Universidad Española. Dear Professor Sachs, as I told you at the beginning, I apologize because I must leave before you start your conference, but a vice rector from Universidad Politécnica will replace me in this seat. Thanks a lot. Muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias, Guillermo. Y a continuación tiene la palabra para hacer la presentación del profesor Sachs, Miguel Ángel Moratín. Por supuesto.
Buenos días. Sean mis primeras palabras de profundo agradecimiento a toda la Universidad Española y en particular a la Universidad de Madrid, a todos sus rectores que están aquí con nosotros y que nos han permitido organizar este gran encuentro de futuro, de presente y de futuro. Como no, a los que están, como bien decía el rector de la Universidad Complutense, en esta parte del estrado, y no olvidar los que están en la otra parte de la audiencia, pero lógicamente tanto Carlos Andradas como Guillermo Cisneros nos han acompañado para introducir la conferencia de Jeffrey Sachs. Como presidente de la Red Española de Desarrollo Sostenible, y quiero señalar la presencia de Teresa Rivera como vicepresidenta del Consejo Asesor, es para nosotros un gran momento en donde hemos podido lograr avanzar en la sensibilización y profundización de esta nueva agenda, de esta nueva cultura de sostenibilidad. Voy a ser breve porque aquí todos hemos venido a escuchar al profesor Jeffrey Sachs. Y presentar a Jeffrey, a doctor Jeffrey Sachs, es fácil. Es fácil porque todo el mundo conoce su gran prestigio como académico, como profesor. Todos, muchos de nosotros y muchos de ustedes habrán leído sus escritos, le siguen por los distintos sistemas de comunicación y de enseñanza. Pero para mí, como también actor en el mundo global, en el mundo de las relaciones internacionales, el compartir y el presentar a Jeffrey Sachs es una gran satisfacción. Hemos sido compañeros de viaje, de muchas aventuras conjuntas, en la época de los Objetivos de Desarrollo del Milenio, cuando el objetivo principal era erradicar la pobreza, erradicar el hambre, y todavía hoy nos llegan imágenes y declaraciones de que hay más de 22 millones en el Cuerno de África y una situación de catástrofe humanitaria en Somalia. Y todavía la comunidad internacional no ha sabido dar respuestas para eliminar esas lacras de la actualidad y de la humanidad. Jeffrey Sachs es un multilateralista, sigue una palabra rara, que a veces se traba la lengua a uno, multilateralismo, sabemos decir los diplomáticos, difícil de pronunciar, pero que detrás de ello va defendiendo el trabajar juntos, no de forma aislada, no de un solo país, de una sola persona, no de un solo sector, sino todos los sectores de la comunidad internacional. La universidad es, por lo tanto, el lugar idóneo, queridos rectores, para hacer este acto un acto histórico. Porque es la universidad la que puede servir de eslabón, de catalizador de la enseñanza, del conocimiento, de la cultura, con la formación, la divulgación, la investigación, el encontrar soluciones prácticas, como quiere la red que preside Jeffrey Sachs. Y en ese trabajo de la universidad queremos una universidad que no sea sostenible intramuros, sino que sea una universidad extramuros, que sea una universidad que en los próximos años crea a todos los universitarios mundiales y por lo tanto europeos y por lo tanto españoles dentro de la cultura de sostenibilidad, que cree sus centros de investigación, que introduzca los índices de cumplimiento de los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible. Y por lo tanto tener aquí a Jeffrey esta tarde, esta mañana, nos puede servir para todavía encontrar un compromiso mayor. Jeffrey es multilateralista, pero es sobre todo un hombre de la era del antropoceno, sí, de esa era en donde la humanidad, por primera vez en la historia, podemos decidir nuestro futuro. Le preguntaban en la rueda de prensa, ¿es usted optimista, señor Sachs? Todavía con la situación que observamos cada día al levantarnos a escuchar las noticias del mundo, y contestó con claridad, claro que soy optimista, porque por primera vez en la historia la humanidad tenemos el destino en nuestras manos. Por primera vez en la historia los ciudadanos pueden decidir su futuro y sabemos cuál debe ser nuestro futuro, si no queremos caer atrapados en las fronteras planetarias que el mismo profesor Sachs define. Por lo tanto, Jeffrey es conocido como un profesor, un gran académico Yo añadiría, es un gran político, un político con ética y con solidaridad. Y sobre todo lo que es un hombre que quiere combatir, que quiere luchar para crear un mundo mejor. Sí, frente al America First, Jeffrey Sachs dice the world first, el mundo primero. Y ese mundo es el que tú, con todos nosotros, vamos a construir en un futuro. The floor is yours, Jeffrey. Thank you to come to here to Spain.
Oh, wow. Thank you very, very much. What an enormous honor to be here. I'm really thrilled, and I'm very, very deeply touched also with all of the leadership of so many of Spain's great universities present. That's a profound honor for me, and also for all of the students here. Thank you. Thank you for the chance to share some time today talking about important issues. I come from a young university. I just calculated when Complutense was, when Columbia University opened its doors, Complutense already had 462 years of existence. And we started in 1754. We think we're pretty good in the United States, but we're just youngsters compared to this great institution. And it is a tremendous honor to be here, and also very humbling, and also a great reminder of my main theme, which is that universities have a unique role to play in society. Universities are the most forward-looking institutions of our society. Universities bring together the greatest intellectual energy, and especially the energy of young people who are intent to make a better world. And that makes universities uniquely suited and uniquely responsible for our time. And my main argument today is we have a big job to do. We have a big opportunity to do it. And if the universities don't do it, nobody else is going to find the path to sustainable development. I've been now a practicing development economist for 32 years and a student of economics for 45 years. And I can tell you one thing: governments are not going to lead the way. They don't know how. They're trapped in short-term thinking. My government is crazy, to use a technical term. My president, I don't even know where to start. Nobody does. We do know where to end, though, with a new president. But we're not going to solve our problems if we're waiting for your government, or my government, even less likely, to solve the problems that are in front of us. And so the topic for me today is how we can get organized to do our part, knowing that our part is a major leadership challenge. Sustainable development is the key concept that brings us here. And it's very important for us to understand what it means and why we have these 17 goals at the center of our attention. We adopted the idea of sustainable development as a world community because our global economy does certain things well, but is doing other things miserably, dangerously, not serving human purposes. And sustainable development is the idea that we need to reorient our economic model from local to global in a way to meet human needs. What does our economy do well? It actually produces massive, unprecedented levels of output at unprecedented levels of efficiency on a global scale. What the world economy accomplishes is absolutely spectacular. Every year now, world output is about $125 trillion for the 7.5 billion people on the planet. We've reached an average output, per person for more than 7 billion people, of more than $17,000 per person, averaged over the entire world. It's simply astounding to think about that, because that level of wealth and productivity was beyond imagining in earlier eras. If anyone had said to an economist, much less to anybody else 50 or 100 years ago, the average output in the world will be more than $15,000 per person, that would have been deemed to be crazy, impossible. And to be told that that would be true for 7.5 billion people would have been thought a certain kind of madness. And who would have even dreamt 40 years ago that China would achieve more than 3.5 decades of double-digit economic growth, so that a society of 1.4 billion people would double and then double again and then double again, then double again, then double one more time for a 30-time increase in output over a 35-year period. That's what the modern world economy has made possible. And now India, also with 1.4 billion people, is growing at more than 7% per year. Prime Minister Modi just won a major state election in Uttar Pradesh, a state so populous with more than 200 million people, it would be first, second, third, fourth, it would be the 5th largest country in the world, I believe, 5th or 6th, if it were standalone. And this suggests that India is going to be doubling in economic output every decade, if not faster. So the world economy does this extraordinarily well. It produces and it achieves economic growth. And that's true even as we continue to suffer the lingering effects of the 2008 financial crisis and the slow growth in Europe and the United States, so-called. This is not a worldwide slow growth phenomenon. This has been a crisis of the North Atlantic region, because Asia has continued to grow rapidly all throughout this period. But if we had been told 40 years ago that the average production in the world would reach more than $15,000 per person, I'll tell you one thing that I'm sure I would have said, and that is, well, poverty would have been ended and people would be happy. And yet we have arrived at this affluence with continuing major crises of deprivation, with millions of people dying every year of their extreme poverty still, and with a profound crisis of confidence rather than the kind of euphoria that might have been expected to greet this kind of affluence. And I would have said, if I had been told this 40 years ago when I was a student of economics, that there would be so much economic growth and improvement and technological advance, I would have said, well, surely the world would have addressed every major challenge because money would not be the obstacle. We'd be rich enough and we'd have the technological means to address any big challenge, whether it's pollution control or ensuring the survival of biodiversity or the health of our oceans and the health of our atmosphere. The reason we have adopted sustainable development is that it has turned out that the world economy is doing one thing well and two things miserably badly. The world economy is achieving economic growth, but it is not achieving social justice. It is not ending the suffering of the poor. It is not narrowing the income inequalities. And even worse, it is rapidly bringing us to the very edge of environmental catastrophe. And so the idea of adopting the Sustainable Development Goals is the idea that we need to combine three fundamental objectives in our public life. And that is the continued improvement of our material conditions, especially to end extreme poverty and to improve the lives of people who are still stuck near poverty levels, if not in extreme poverty. But we can improve the lives of people all over the world, including in the high-income countries such as Spain and the United States as well, because technology allows that to happen. But to do that in a way that is socially fair, that is inclusive, that breaks down old barriers of gender or barriers against indigenous populations or minority groups, so that everybody can share in this prosperity, and does it in a way that is safe physically for our survival. Part of that remains to end the unbelievable dangers of nuclear war, which are still with us every day as risks on this planet, and we should never let down our guard even one day to the risks of our self-destruction, because we know our capacity to engage in that. But it's not only the weapons, it's the destruction of the physical bases of our survival. And we know that there are two fundamental environmental crises that we face. One is the human-made climate change that is now well underway, that has brought us 3 years in a row now of the warmest years recorded in the instrument record going back to 1880, and probably 3 of the warmest years in the last 4,000 years on the planet. And we know that that's just a hint of what would happen if we don't get the climate change under control. And the other fundamental environmental crisis is that humanity, by reaching 7.5 billion people, and by being so productive and our capacity to use primary resources in such volume, in such scale all over the world, is now fundamentally threatening the rest of the biosphere. In other words, one species, us, is appropriating about half of the world's land, water, ecosystem services, net primary productivity that the rest of the biosphere, the rest of the plants and animals can't find their place for survival right now on the planet because we're pushing them right towards extinction. And climate change is doing part of it, pollution is doing part of it, diversion of water supplies is doing part of it, the destruction of habitat of other species is doing part of it as we clear-cut massive forests, for instance, in Indonesia and Malaysia, to make room for massive plantations of monocultures, for example, of palm oil, thereby putting other species, our closest relatives, in that case the orangutans, or other great ape species, at the very risk of extinction. So sustainable development is a reflection of urgent need and of opportunity. To say that we can use our know-how, our technology, this unprecedentedly massive world economy for human well-being. In a sense, for me, it's hard to imagine any other choice. But then every day I wake up as an American citizen and I realize there are other possibilities. And it's worth saying a word about my country, for an example, because it's both an important country and because it is a case in point of what can go absolutely wrong in our world. Because I believe the United States is certainly one of the most dangerous countries in the world today. And it is one of the countries whose politics is least in line with sustainable development. So what happened in the United States is we adopted a certain kind of new religion. The high priest of the new religion is Ayn Rand. I don't know if people here have read Ayn Rand. She wrote popular novels that were treated as philosophy. As philosophy, it's garbage. As novels, it's just frightening. Because her idea is that selfishness is really the cause of humanity. That people should just defend their turf, their freedom, what they have, and not care about others, and not care about nature, but just care about their own wealth, their own prerogatives, their own freedom of action, and that's what makes a strong society. Of course, it's a terrifying idea. It's even more terrifying that it has become our national politics. Our politics are now based on the idea that private property, not human well-being, is the center of social organization. The United States, for example, is the only country in the world that has not ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity to protect the biosphere. One country out of 193 UN member states. Why have we not ratified it? Because our right-wing political leaders said that protecting biodiversity threatened private property. Think about that. They said that we will not ratify the treaty because it is within the rights of private property owners to destroy the biodiversity on their land, and that nobody should tell them otherwise. And we are now in an assault on nature in my own country. President Trump is kind of a wild caricature of this approach. The only thing the party in power dreams of is tax cuts and deregulation and repudiating global agreements of any kind. And this is why I say the United States is such a profound danger to itself and to the world right now. We actually came to teach these things in the United States. The sanctity of private property, that it is the goal above all other goals. Well, sustainable development points us in a fundamentally different direction. It says that our starting point is human well-being, not private property. Our starting point is the goal of creating a world that is fit for all. It also embodies a virtue that the Catholic Church calls the universal destination of goods, which is a doctrine of Catholic teaching that says while private property rights are fine and important even, they are never inviolate. In other words, they're not the highest standard of justice. The highest standard of justice is human need. And if private property ever comes into conflict with human need, it is the property rights that give way, not the human need that gives way. And so sustainable development is calling for a different philosophical approach for us. Start with what's important for us as human beings, and then design 21st century institutions, our public life, our public space, the working of government, the regulation of nature, or the regulation of human activity in nature, I should say, so that we're serving true, long-term, just purposes of social fairness, of prosperity, and of true environmental sustainability. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals are the best hope we have to achieve this vision. And that's extremely important for us. Let me give you a little bit of background about these goals, why we have them in this way. The idea of sustainable development is not new to 2 years ago. It's actually more than a quarter century old, but it has not worked yet. The term came into public awareness already back in 1987, 30 years ago, when one of our great statesmen of our time, Dr. Gro Brundtland, then the Prime Minister of Norway, headed a commission that said, we are on a collision course with nature. And she and her commission put forward the idea of sustainable development. And at that time, it was defined as meeting our generation's needs in a way that it will allow future generations to meet their future needs. And that idea was embodied in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. All of the UN countries came together in Rio a quarter century ago to adopt sustainable development as the central concept and to adopt 3 major treaties. The first on climate change, the second on biological diversity, and the third on fighting the spread of deserts in the dryland parts of the world. So these are the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. 3 big treaties agreed in 1992. I teach those treaties every year. I have my students read them. If you haven't read them, I would urge you to go online and read these treaties. They're pretty short and they're very convincing. They're well-negotiated documents. They were adopted 25 years ago. Not one of them has succeeded at all. What happened was we adopted them and then basically ignored them or fought about them or gave speeches about them like I'm doing, but didn't implement them. As I said, the United States never even got around to ratifying the Biodiversity Treaty. I've never heard a US politician once in 25 years mention the Treaty on Desertification. And the only thing I've heard from most of our leaders about the convention to the Framework Convention on Climate Change is by our current president and other leaders why we should have nothing to do with it. So we adopted these 3 treaties, and time went on, and in 2012 there was a 20th anniversary of the Rio Summit to see what had happened. And when the government officials got together in Rio again in June 2012, the only conclusion was we failed. 3 good treaties, no results. The climate going out of control, biodiversity in a great extinction, and deserts continuing to expand, and those dryland regions, places of conflict, like Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or Somalia or Ethiopia or Sudan. Those are the places that the Desertification Treaty was aiming to help. They gave no help at all. Those places are now at war. They weren't helped at all. So in 2012, the governments were in a bit of desperation. What should we do? And they came up with one good idea. And they said, we have to do anything to let the public know that we are really in a crisis. We need to make these treaties not only legal instruments for diplomats and lawyers, we need to make this concept a living, breathing concept for global society and for politics. And so they adopted the idea of having sustainable development goals. You might say, that's it? And in a way, that's the best that they could come up with. And I don't have too much hope for governments doing much more than that, unless we take the lead. But what the governments did was You see, we're near the end. What the governments did was to say, we need to make clear worldwide what we really need to do. And if we could put up those goals one more time, I don't know if it's possible, but that page of goals, they summarize these three major areas that we need to combine for an integral economy. They summarize the goals of improving material life and ending poverty, of making our societies more inclusive and just, and of combating environmental ills. And they do it in a very actually helpful way because they're very straightforward. They say that here for ending poverty or for health or for education or for climate or for cities are achievements that we can reach by the year 2030. And so they set specific milestones that are achievable at a global level. And for one of those important goals on climate change, the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals was followed a few weeks later by the Paris Climate Agreement, which was reached in December 2015 in Paris, and it set some very specific targets, the most important of which is the global commitment to end the net emissions of greenhouse gases by around mid-century so that the world can keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial temperature. In other words, the governments agreed to a target on a maximum level of warming, saying that we must not have the Earth warm compared to the pre-industrial temperature by 2 degrees Celsius. Now, the key point for us, and let me bring it to our context and our responsibility, is that these are the only global goals that we have for our generation and the only global goals that we are going to have to help us reorient the world economy in a safe direction. They took 3 years to negotiate in the case of choosing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, these goals that you see here. 3 full years of negotiation, and then they were unanimously adopted. The Paris Climate Agreement, you could say, took 25 years to negotiate because there was 25-year interval from adopting the framework convention to adopting the means for its implementation. For us, ladies and gentlemen, either we make these goals real and make them work, or we will fail in our generation to head off disaster. It's as simple as that. You might say it's unfair, especially the students. Who gave us that homework assignment? How come we're left with such a mess? And it's absolutely true that the previous generation of politicians has failed badly. And that's my generation too. And in the United States, as I've said, we've done even worse. We went back to a politics sometime of the middle of the 20th century, because Donald Trump's idea of the world is to dig more coal mines and build more oil pipelines and pollute as fast as he can. And to try to understand his mind is very tough. But the only thing I could say is he lives completely in the past and in illusions. He has no idea about living in the 21st century and about our current and future needs. But that's where we come in, because these goals are what we absolutely need, and for young people here, what you need for your safety and for the safety of the world and for a world that's safe for your children and for future generations. To my mind, this is as close as I can think to the kind of challenge that I remember as a very young boy growing up in the United States in a very different age, when I had a president who we admired, even revered, compared to the one we have today. Because President Kennedy had the idea that our purpose was to solve great problems. One of the problems that he wanted to solve was the Cold War, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But in this picture, President Kennedy is calling on the American people in a famous speech in May 1961, 56 years ago, to take up the challenge of the moonshot. And I just want to read this to you for a moment, because I believe sustainable development is the moonshot of our generation. President Kennedy said this: "I believe that this nation, the United States, should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish." So President Kennedy went to the American people and he said, "I believe that we should go to the moon." And more than that, he didn't say we should try that, he said we should do it this decade. Not someday, but this decade. And then he didn't say, like a politician would say today, "Don't worry, it's easy and it's cheap." He said none will be so difficult or expensive. And in this famous speech, he went on for several paragraphs saying to the US Congress that day, "Do not do this unless you're ready to pay for it. This is not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick. It's not going to be cheap. Don't do it halfway. Unless you're ready to bear the cost, it's better we don't even get started with this." And of course, at the end of the speech, the whole Congress rose to its feet and adopted President Kennedy's goal. And 8 years later, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in a feat of technological genius that is almost unimaginable in this day, except for the fact that if we tried it, we could do so many wonderful things like this. And when we do occasionally try it, for example, sequencing the human genome, again and again we show these great challenges can be accomplished ahead of schedule when we put our best minds to it. What President Kennedy did with the moonshot was focus America on that goal, inspire people, mobilize resources, and it took 500,000 employees of 20,000 companies working together under one umbrella created by the US government to accomplish the job in a little over 8 years. Sustainable development has the same features. we have to decarbonize the energy system. We have to shift from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. We have to make agriculture environmentally sound rather than extensive and destroying habitat, polluting the environment, and draining the groundwater regions of the world. We have to make health care available for all. And by the way, to give you just another glimpse into the evil that is lurking in Washington right now, in the latest debates we're having in healthcare, the Republican-led Congress and the President have put forward a plan to cut back the health program of President Obama. And yesterday, the independent agency charged with evaluation declared that it would put 24 million people out of health coverage. And the President's reaction was, who cares? And so that's what happens when sheer greed and malignity take over. But sustainable development, again, is the complete opposite side of this. It puts the human being first. And it calls on us in SDG 3 to ensure universal access to health coverage. And SDG 4 calls on us to achieve universal access to quality education, at least through a secondary level for every child in the world. So my call to the universities is this. These are complex, technologically based challenges. These cannot be accomplished with business as usual. These cannot be accomplished by the incumbent businesses in the world. And in many cases, especially in the case of the oil, gas, and coal industry, those companies basically have to close down by mid-century to a large extent. There's no real role in this world for coal companies anymore. They have to gradually, or more than gradually, get out of business because we do not have the atmospheric capacity to handle their CO2 emissions. But what we do have is ample solar energy, wind energy, geothermal potential, hydroelectric potential, fourth-generation nuclear energy, at least some areas of advanced bioenergy, some potential for carbon capture and sequestration, the potential for self-driving electric vehicles or fuel cell vehicles, nanotechnologies that are vastly more energy efficient, batteries that can quickly charge and recharge at grid scale, flow batteries and other technologies that can provide storage for intermittent energy sources, new information technologies to make healthcare available on your smartphone so that it can be your constant laboratory if you need testing of blood gases. It can become a sonogram. It can become an EKG machine if you need it. It can be used for monitoring, for remote diagnostics. Information technology can revolutionize education so that even in places where there are no teachers, there can be learning and connection to worldwide information, and on and on. I don't see the limits because we are in such a revolutionary period of technological advance that it is wrong-headed to think that any of these goals is out of reach. And if you can land on the moon in 8 years when there were barely computers, and the one computer that NASA had less computational power than any of our smartphones, and still you could go to the moon, we can figure out how to make sure that our $17,000 per capita world economy can meet everybody's health needs, education needs, and energy needs in a productive, just, and sustainable manner. Now, for us at universities, let's understand governments will not be able to do this. They do not know the technological changes. Their job is not to think, it's to hold power. Their time span is not 2030 or 2050, it's the next election. They are all enmeshed in short-term politics, and they cannot think straight. And that's why the universities have to step forward. Of course, with teaching and training, that goes without question because no other institution is charged with that. Of course, with basic research, because our universities are the home of the world's leading basic research, often in collaboration with industry. But now, with the generation of public policy ideas, of roadmaps, of milestones, and of the convening of civil society to help get this work done. And so what I appeal to Spain's great universities, some of the greatest and most famous in the world and in world history, is let's work together to show that the Sustainable Development Goals are practicable, that they will boost the economy, they will create jobs and opportunities, they will promote fairness because that's their design, and they will project and protect the fragile ecosystems of this country and its neighborhood. For Spain, there are several areas where leadership is vital. Of course, one is within your own country, because no place but Spain itself can achieve sustainable development in Spain. So you are responsible for the future of this country. But Spain plays several other critical roles. Spain is a leader and has been, of course, throughout history, of the Mediterranean Basin region. And this is a region of unified history of thousands of years that is in crisis right now. It's in geopolitical crisis because of the divide of the Christian and Muslim world. It is in ecological crisis because the Mediterranean basin is warming and drying. It is in ecological crisis because the Mediterranean itself is profoundly polluted with microplastics and other pollutants. And the solutions for the Mediterranean require Mediterranean leadership. And I look forward to the day when Spain and its leading universities can help to bring together the leading universities from the 32 Mediterranean Basin societies, many of them also ancient centers of learning like Al-Azhar in Cairo and other famed universities, and work together to save the Mediterranean from environmental threats that are very, very grave, and also to make the Mediterranean economic system work once again for high levels of productivity, not the sick part of Europe, but the dynamic part of this region. And that's absolutely within reach, and I think it's Spain's special calling, actually. And Spain, of course, is also the key bridge between the Americas and Europe. And Spain has, I think, a tremendous opportunity as well to bring Latin America and Europe together on this great challenge. So this is a worldwide calling. It's a worldwide opportunity. I think it is a worldwide necessity. I think it is your generation's greatest challenge. Thank you very much.
Bueno, como anuncié al principio, yo creo que tenemos un poquitín de tiempo para algunas preguntas. Entonces, imagino que habrá micrófonos por aquí circulando. Entonces, como siempre, por favor, si alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta, pues que levante la mano para que le pasen el micrófono. Por allí veo ya alguna ahí a mi derecha. Y allí en el lado izquierdo también veo. Gracias. Sí. Venga, empezamos por esta de aquí, que creo que ha sido la primera mano que he visto. Aquí a mi derecha.
Thank you, Professor Sachs, for your excellent presentation. I'm an Indian diplomat currently posted in Spain. And from India, we are very honored to have you here, exponent on development aspects in the third world countries and on poverty alleviation. Professor, this is with relation to the press conference you had before the general elections in 2014 in India, where you spoke about India needs a business-like government to come in, and which would work more towards developing the infrastructure, power, and also suppressing all the leakages in the subsidies and streamlining the subsidy. Now, with the present government, which is functioning for more than 3 years, and we see a lot of reforms like the demonetization reform and the Aadhaar system, where the subsidy has been tapped and has been streamlined and really going in the right picture. What do you think will be the future of India? Because you also mentioned during the press conference that when such a government comes, achieving 10% or more year-on-year growth is possible. And we are currently at the rate of 7%. Do you think we'll be able to go beyond it? Thank you, Professor.
El profesor Sachs sugiere que recojamos varias preguntas. Entonces, había otra allí al fondo. Bueno, o ya que estás ahí con el micrófono, venga, sí, por favor, adelante.
Good morning. Thank you, Professor Sachs, for being here, for the universities, for making it possible. I'd like to know, at the beginning of your speech, you started talking about how fast the economy is growing nowadays, and at the very end, you said that achieving the goals would boost the economy. But do you believe it is feasible to achieve the goals without slowing down economy? And moreover, don't you think that if we continue growing so fast, countries like Spain or the United States, there are some countries that will never be able to catch up? Thank you.
Y una tercera, y le damos la palabra al profesor Sachs. Allí al final, en la última fila, también veo varias manos levantadas. Ahí, venga, adelante, luego vamos hacia la derecha.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. My comment was more looking at not such the macro scale of the economies of the governments, but us as individuals within Spain, within universities, what kind of like micro economy, what kind of steps on our everyday lives can from your point of view, obviously, to achieve these goals that we are all looking forward to see happening.
Thank you very much. Let me say a word about India, which will be the most populous country in the world. It's just about to overtake China in total population. India may reach about 1.7 billion people by mid-century, whereas China is probably going to peak at 1.4 billion and maybe end this century at around a billion people because of the much lower fertility rates. So what happens in India is extremely important for India and very important for the world. India is a poor country still, though it has now been achieving relatively rapid progress for a quarter century, and now the economic growth rate is about 7% and rising. What India is doing that I think is most notable is putting a lot of reliance on the new information technologies. There's a tremendous expertise in India in information engineering, and India is the leader in showing how to turn that into sustainable development practice, actually. I'll give one example. India pioneered, about starting roughly 5 years ago, a unique online identification system that uses the biometric iris scan, the eye scan. And India has now put online 1.2 billion people with unique ID, called the Aadhaar program. It was led by a brilliant leader of information technology named Nandan Nilekani, who had been the CEO of Infosys. So this is a high-tech project that now has driven down the cost of getting an individual online with a unique ID to under $1 per registrant. And India is now bringing that to Africa, for example, where there are 1 billion people in Africa, but hundreds of millions without legal ID. And India is going to help the African countries to formalize their ID system now, and I'm helping to make that intermediation between India and the African governments. What India has been doing with that unique ID is deploying it in many functional areas. Electronic medical records is one example. Targeted subsidies, so instead of just giving out coupon books in the old-fashioned subsidy system, which was prone to huge corruption, India is now actually just electronically crediting accounts based on unique ID with targeted subsidies and saving a lot of money doing it. And then recently, some of you may have read about how suddenly Prime Minister Modi's government, from one day to the next, took 2 big banknotes out of circulation, said they will no longer be regarded as legal tender because they're used in illegal black transactions. And so people had to return their cash to the banks. And there was a huge squeeze on payments. How do you pay your bills? How do you buy groceries? How do you buy vegetables at the stand in the village? And what the government did was dramatically multiply the use of e-payments by linking this Aadhaar system with many innovative ways to speed electronic payments. Well, people said Modi would lose the elections and get a big backlash for having done this, but he just won a landslide, as I mentioned, in the state of Uttar Pradesh this past weekend, taking more than 300 seats. So he has the biggest win in many decades in the most populous state of India. So my answer to the question is India's made a huge breakthrough, in my view. It is on its way to I think that this is politically a situation now that could enable India to end poverty in this generation by deploying these technologies and using this mass-scale information technology approach. And I find it extremely exciting and very, very promising. It comes to the question about growth, because I keep talking about growth. For environmentalists, that sounds dangerous. Aren't you mixed up, Professor Sachs? Aren't you supposed to be leader of the zero growth contingent? And for me, this is a little bit of a semantical question, because the way we measure things is all wrong top to bottom. So when I speak of growth, I'm not speaking of a traditional national income account, which I teach in my classes. I'm speaking about growth meaning progress. And the question is, do we have to stop progress in order to save the environment? And my answer is no. We have to change the technological direction. For example, is our goal to use less energy? Not exactly. It is to be energy efficient, not to waste energy by appliances that run even when they're not being used. But it's not to use less energy, because free energy is absolutely wonderful. It's how we do useful work. That's the definition of free energy, basically, thermodynamically. And so we're going to have to mobilize a lot more energy. Can we do that safely? Yes, as long as it's not coal, oil, and gas, but as solar, wind, geothermal, and other energy sources that are not going to wreck the climate. And so in this sense, I want to measure growth properly. I want to claim that we can have continued progress in material conditions, even in rich countries, longer life expectancy. It doesn't mean more, though. It means healthier, it means happier, it means more sustainable, but it does mean progress. And in poor countries where half the population is still working in very hard physical labor, they want conventional growth in the sense of more productivity, so arduous physical labor and short lives can be replaced by less difficult lives, healthier lives, longer lives, more chance to enjoy modern technology, vacation time, leisure time, travel time, the things that rich countries take for granted that poor countries want. And so I'm a believer in economic growth, but I know that there are two huge risks that need to be addressed. One is the energy mix. We have to decarbonize. And the other is the agriculture systems. They have to become sustainable, which they're not. We don't grow food in a sustainable way. We don't use food in a sustainable way. And our production is going to become more unstable with climate change. And so in this sense, we have to do things differently, not to just say less. We have to do things fundamentally differently. There's no amount of energy conservation that's going to stop global warming. The only way to stop global warming is to shift out of carbon-based fuels and to move to a low-carbon energy system, and to do that in a remarkably quick time period. Spain is lucky, not lucky, you've done your homework. Spain has some of the leaders of industry in this. Iberdrola and Acciona, for example, are world-class companies in this. And it's really important to use that not only to decarbonize your own energy system and stop driving diesel cars and go to electric vehicles, but also to use your leaders as export lead for this country to promote the green economy worldwide and earn income from it. Because this is Spain's economic future as well, to become a green leader that is selling green infrastructure and building green infrastructure in other parts of the world. So it's actually absolutely part of an economic strategy as well. So those are my main observations on growth and on India. On the question of the personal microeconomy, I think this is a fun challenge. It's really important to take it as a personal challenge. What am I going to do to contribute to this solution? Because this is a big challenge for our generation. And so finding a meaningful way to do it is really important. Obviously, the way you do it professionally is part of the story. It doesn't matter which area of university life you're in, by the way, whether you're going into business, whether you're going into public health, whether you're going into chemistry, whether you're going into engineering. Every area needs to redirect towards sustainable development. Economics needs a remake from the bottom up. As I described earlier, the whole philosophical base of Anglo-Saxon economics is messed up in my view, because it should start from the moral point of view, not from the property rights point of view. So everything we do, you can think about how can your area contribute to this. But I think there are other ways as well. Of course, as citizens, this is quite important. So we have to hold our political parties' feet to the fire. What is your sustainable development agenda? What is your SDG agenda? If you don't have one, we're not voting for you, because there's no way you can provide prosperity. It means your eyes aren't even open. I'm trying to start a new party in the United States. You've got some experience with that. Because our two leading parties are both deficient. One insanely greedy and the other just deficient. But this is a political issue for sure. So that's a second area of individual engagement. A third area is as consumers. We really need to come up with the right list of companies whose products we just absolutely have to stop buying. Because there are a lot of junky companies around. The problem is that the worst companies like Exxon and Chevron, which are just evil, actually. Sorry to use the technical term. But they're just so nasty, and you cannot believe how they behave. They don't have enough of a consumer face that we can easily boycott them. But we should go to companies that are selling products that are dangerous, that are producing them in a dangerous way, that don't have a sustainable supply chain, and say goodbye, nevermore, and feel good every time you pass their products. Because I think our consumer power has not been put to the test properly. And I'm getting ready to go after the companies that are part of the American Chamber of Commerce, which is the biggest business lobby in the United States. And maybe it doesn't fit under the rubric of pure evil, but it does fit under the rubric of disgusting. Because most of what they're trying to do is to stop decent policies. And I'm trying to get a list of the companies that are members and say it's enough for you to be a member of this horrible organization for us just not to buy your products anymore. And so I think the consumer side is another personal side that we should really cultivate. And finally, I would give the following suggestion. Go home to your mother, father, daughter, son, spouse, colleague, significant other, partner, and ask, what is SDG 11? And they say, what is SDG? What? You don't know what the Sustainable Development Goals are? Well, I kind of heard of that. What? And start educating. And then quiz them every day. And then encourage them to go out and educate their friends. And soon enough, we know it's just 7 degrees of separation. Everyone in the world will know all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I think probably to stop.
Bueno, vamos a terminar el acto porque el profesor Sachs tiene que marcharse y lleva ya bastante encima. Simplemente quería, antes de abandonar la sala, agradecer su presencia aquí, decir que nos ha dejado deberes puestos, ¿no?, encima de la mesa. Los deberes de, bueno, cuál es el papel de las universidades precisamente en el desarrollo de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Tenemos evidentemente que enseñar todo esto, pero tenemos que hacer más que enseñarlo. Tenemos primero que creérnoslo todos y cada uno y tenemos que incorporarlo también en nuestros campus, tenemos que incorporarlo en nuestra forma de actuar y en nuestra forma de vivir. Sabemos que somos los responsables, como nos ha dicho él, del desarrollo de estos objetivos en España, pero que también tenemos que extenderlo a lo que es el ámbito del Mediterráneo y también colaborar en el ámbito latinoamericano. Querido Professor Sachs, dear Professor Sachs, thanks for your lecture, thanks for your time. You know that you are welcome here whenever you want. And good luck in your new party, this new adventure that you announced here.
Thank you.
So if we can help on that, yes, count on it. Muchísimas gracias y quiero agradecer para terminar a los que han hecho posible esta conferencia aquí y permitidme que los singularice pues, en 3 personas. Por una parte, Miguel Ángel Moratinos, muchísimas gracias, Miguel Ángel, y después a los 2 codirectores del máster en estrategias y tecnologías del desarrollo que también nos acompañan aquí. Por parte de la Complutense, el profesor José Antonio Alonso, y por parte de la Universidad Politécnica, perdonadme que tengo que mirar el nombre porque no me lo sé, pues Carlos Matáis, me lo han soplado por aquí. Muchísimas gracias.